Hello, everyone, and welcome to this round table under the paving stones, how to live with 50-degree temperatures. So we can feel it today. Well, it was worse yesterday at this time of day, but it's still quite hot. I'm Cécile Desjardins. I'm the editor at L'Opinion, and I'm very happy to be with you to talk about this major topic of adaptation, attenuation of our cities and territories given the challenges of climate change. So we have roughly 55 minutes by Bertrand, who is the director of the Francophone studio MVRDV. Beside you, Jérôme STUBLER from Equance. This is an NG spin-off, a leader of energy and services worldwide. Then Bénédicte Martin. You're the local here, vice president in charge of agriculture and rurality for the Sud, the south region of France, and it's increasingly hot in the south of France. Beside you, Philippe MAILLARD. Hello, Philippe. You're the general manager of APAV, in charge of managing technical, human, and environmental risks. And Frédéric, you're president of Gazelle Energy, a producer and supplier of energy. And of course, all of this under the coordination of Christian SAINT-ÉTIENNE, member of the Cercle des Économistes, and I'm going to let you lay the groundwork for the debate. Hello, everyone. It's a 2 to 3 minute introduction, as we always do at the Cercle. The question is, global warming is accelerating. 2015 to 2023 were the hottest years on record since the 1800s. The average temperature globally has increased by 1.3 degrees Celsius compared with the pre-industrial era. So we need to, at this roundtable discussion, look at the next 20 to 30 years, trying to anticipate global warming that's accelerating with the uncertainty about the importance of this global warming. If it's 1 degree more, it's not the same thing as if it's 3 to 4 degrees more. We're not here to frighten ourselves and to say this is the end of the world. So we've tried in this round table to imagine solutions. So what are the questions that we can ask? What impact of global warming on daily lives and the health of the population, in particular with respect to France, Italy, and Spain, and how our countries could see their living conditions change, how to adapt infrastructure and housing to these recurrent episodes of strong heat that we'll see in the coming years. And another key topic, and we're lucky to have the vice president of the regional Conseil Régional in charge of these questions. How can these very high temperatures impact agriculture and distribution of food in the coming years? If we're looking at 10 to 15 years down the road, how can we anticipate transformation, particularly for forests? Can we start changing tree species to anticipate this warming? Another section that we might address is that of natural disasters that could arise. How can we anticipate them and plan for them? What can we do to avoid these terrible events? And lastly, since France has thousands of kilometers of coastline, how can we anticipate the consequences on our coast? Should we imagine that the coastlines will be protected? Have we thought about this? And what are the policies that we could set up to not be surprised in 10, 15 years and see the nefarious effects that we had not anticipated. So just a few questions that we're going to try to answer at this roundtable discussion. So I'll hand you back the floor, Cécile. Yes, we're looking at a few years down the road. So Bertrand, for the architect that you are, what are the challenges of global warming? Hello, everyone. Firstly, we were saying the title of this round table is Hell Under the Paving Stones. When we talk about construction, it's what's going on below and above the paving stones that's important. Before we start talking about challenges, I'd like in a few seconds to give an overview of the current situation. Unfortunately, I belong to the people who the most participate in the pollution of our planet because construction represents 39% of carbon emissions worldwide. As an architect, it's not an easy hat to wear, role to take on. Another figure, construction is the field that invests the least in innovation, only 2%, and that's insignificant. So today we observe that we need to act in an urgent manner. We don't have the time to wait anymore. We've been saying it for a while, but it's essential for us to comply with the Paris Accords. And how can we find solutions that will have a real immediate impact on our carbon footprint? When I talk about stakes and challenges, I also like to talk about ambition. We're often told that we need to be more responsible, but we don't want to go towards less. We want to stay ambitious. So let's look at this question in a more optimistic, positive manner. I see that there are 3 points in the challenges that we could talk about. The first is we could go beyond the labels. This is important because there are lots of labels, green labels, certifications, but we realize that a lot of them don't really participate in reducing carbon emissions in an immediate way. Just explaining this in a minute, you have to go beyond certification, and I think we need to focus on the carbon footprint, which is immediate, linked to construction, and look at the carbon impact that's linked to energy consumption. But we can look at that in a more long-term way. The other 2 points very quickly. How can we reduce CO2 in usage? How can we design buildings that make sense in their environment? I've come back from Dubai 2 weeks ago, and we were told in a very natural way, well, 70% of our electricity consumption concerns air conditioning. But a different design of buildings would make it possible to reduce this consumption by putting sun shields or putting the open facades on the north side rather than the south side. People who, if we built buildings in Europe the way we're building them in the Middle East, this won't work. How to reduce CO2 in construction? I have an example from Brussels. We decided to do a mixed construction, a concrete core and wooden floors. The floors are 70% of the structure, and that's 60% of the carbon footprint of the building. And just by doing this, we reduce the carbon footprint of 800 kilograms of CO2 equivalent we reduced it to 400. And so it was really a win-win situation. So we're talking about solutions already. That's great. The word energy has been mentioned several times already. Is that really the heart of the challenge for you? Thank you for having invited me. I would like to just say that I'm very optimistic about man's capacity to adapt, optimistic about the adaptation that we're going to launch, and optimistic about decarbonization. If we look at +4, +5 degrees, that means on average 1.5 degrees in Brittany, plus 4 degrees in the Alps. But the average is nice for the people in Brittany. But the thermodynamic machine of the world will accelerate and will have a lot of water in the atmosphere, and this water is energy. It's latent heat as steam, and it's going to create tornadoes like we saw in Corsica 2 years ago and in Mallorca a year ago, with devastating effects that we're going to have to compensate for. A word about adaptation. We talked about this during the preparation. We respond to a lot of energy tenders that concern infrastructure, but there are no calls for tender in the world that take into account climate change. It's excluded. So we meet standards that are based on statistics from the past, on the statistics of the 200 last years, probabilistic, and we say tomorrow will be the same, and that is absolutely false. So we need to work on this question. If I look at energy, there's also something we forget, that a thermal power plant, most electricity power plants are thermal. You lose power when the temperature goes up. When the external temperature goes up, you lose 5 to 6% of the energy produced. So we're going to have to do energy savings. And my colleague on my right is correct. There's a lot that we need to do. For buildings in France, 44% of energy consumption, 44% of total energy consumption. A building that is insulated compared with one that is poorly insulated, we can divide energy consumption by 4 to 6. A building with a geothermal heat pump compared with one that uses direct electrical heating is concerned by a factor of 4. So we can reduce energy consumption by a factor of 8, 10, 12 if we want. If we divide by 10, 44%, we have 40% more energy in France that's available. And this is a path that has started. We're renovating 2% of our buildings in France every year. So it's going to take 50 years to finish. If we invest in building energy renovation and changing the way we heat the buildings, we'll have, and with solutions to create green energy, this will make it possible to consume a lot less energy. We'll come back to energy with Frédéric, but Bénédicte, a focus on agriculture. So are you going to tell us that we won't have enough food in the coming years? That global warming in a region like yours means that you're going to have to produce different products differently? No, thankfully, we have the best assets to deal with this climate change through adaptation. We have agriculture that's always adapted because it's always lived with this Mediterranean climate. So we have room to maneuver for irrigation. On a parcel, we've divided by 75% the water contribution for the same production. We're innovating in culture, and we have a lot of innovation centers, and we're encouraging new sectors like almonds, pistachios that require less water, so we have new crops. So when you're looking at here to 2050, what could frighten us if we do nothing? There are 2 types of territories. We have a large part of the territory with the Rance-Verdon river system until 2050. This system, thanks to our storage, multi-use storage system, makes it possible to stay firm. We'll have a scarcification of the resource by about 10%, but it will be necessary in this region to continue to modernize practices, to use less water, to do more with less. We have other territories that have real droughts, and that's a real problem for them because in those territories where agriculture was possible without irrigation will no longer be able to grow crops without irrigation at all. So we need to go look for water in the water table or in rivers. We know that sometimes we're at low water levels, so we need to find substitution sources like in the Rhone River. We have big projects for the north part of our region. The investments in the Région Sud for 2038, just for irrigation, is €1 billion. That's our budget. Philippe Maillard, you've investigated buildings, and in some of the buildings that you inspected, will things no longer work? If you project in the future, you talked about telephones, machines, factories. Will they be too hot to be used? Hello, everyone. I don't know if we know exactly what all the consequences of living with 50-degree temperatures will be like. Some parts of the planet are already dealing with this a few days or a few weeks or a year. I'm not sure if we know how this is going to impact our living conditions, the use of our facilities, the management of our buildings, agriculture, the food production. So we see that there are forecasts and simulations with emerging solutions, and I think we'll talk about those. But what I want to underscore is the fact that we're talking about risk control. We need to assess the risks associated with this transition. When we look at 150 years of life, my company has been managing risks for 150 years. We see that no risks disappear. Electricity risks have not disappeared. They're well controlled in developed societies, but we have to continue to work on this. And since we're going towards a world that will be increasingly electric, we're going to have to continue to deal with this. But the transition towards a completely different world will lead to new risks that we're going to have to understand, that we're going to have to manage. And an important point that we cannot forget is that we don't like these risks. We're in a society that doesn't accept risk, that needs reassurance, that needs trust. And so we need to manage these transitions with trust, by providing trust in solutions that the companies will be able to provide through innovation, through tests, through solutions. And this trust will be established through the definition of new usage conditions and new rules of the game, living rules and dietary conditions. And companies like mine are here to contribute to building this trust in the management of these conditions that won't be easy. It won't be simple, and we need to stay optimistic because for many years we've been living through different transitions, different evolutions that we've always been able to adapt to. And so I'd like us to bear in mind this collective capacity to work to elaborate transition in a degree of collective confidence that is reasonable. Frédéric, FAROCHE, what's your analysis of the situation? We talked about thermal power plants. I was going to get to answer immediately, but how do you see their position? It's the beginning of my answer. I asked myself, what will happen if this happens tomorrow? If tomorrow or today we have 30 degrees, what if we had 50 degrees tomorrow? How would this impact the grid? Everyone would be plugging in their air conditioning. We'd have a massive increase in electricity demand. And at the same time, as Jérôme said, all of the production means would be suffering from the heat, be it nuclear, wind power, everything would be affected, and we'd see a 50% drop in production, so demand exploding and the production capacity imploding, and that means that the grid manager will try to do load shedding, will slow down regimes, so a part of the population won't have access to electricity, and another part will. It's not so far away. In Central Europe, we're already seeing this. Not 50 degrees, but 35 degrees. So we know what happens. What will happen tomorrow? We could try to extrapolate what we've seen in the last 10 years on this question. What did we see in the last 10 years? We saw a decrease in the final energy consumption. It's 1% per year. We can't yet congratulate ourselves. This is due to sobriety plans and the crisis. And at the same time, this decrease in final energy consumption, we're also seeing an increase in the demand for electricity and an imbalance between production and consumption, as I just described. An increase in electricity demand is good because we're seeing the electrification of usage. Electricity is 100% decarbonized, be it nuclear or renewables. So we've removed carbon here. We're also looking at reindustrialization in the field, which is positive. What's more complicated, though, is the increase in imbalances, as I said earlier. This comes essentially from more intermittent power. Renewable is good, but it is an intermittent source of energy. When there's no sun or no wind, there is no production. So this is a fundamental topic, and it's a problem that we're already facing today that consists in adjusting, balancing supply and demand for electricity, and it's not always easy to do. It's actually very complicated. Let me just illustrate what we've already seen this year. We saw excess supply for 300 hours this year with the price of electricity at zero. That's good for the consumer. But then we had to stop during that time PV plants and wind power plants in France because that's what's the easiest to stop. So that's waste. That's the only word that comes to mind. We've also seen deficits in energy, deficits in this supply, and the answer that we had is to ask certain electro-intensive industry to shut down. It's a solution, but I'm not sure that in the rest of the world industries will stop. I would like them to continue to work, and it's the same word that we can use. It's waste. So the challenge, the main challenge for the electric grid to make sure that this doesn't happen tomorrow is to produce flexible green energy that we can store, and we're not there yet. Christian officially forbade us to be pessimistic. So let's talk about solutions now. Christian said we were not allowed to be pessimistic. Some of you have already mentioned some solutions. We talked about being optimistic. So what will allow us to leave here today feeling good? We're not too hot today already. So what ideas do you have so that things will go well, so that we'll survive? Bertrand, you're looking at me. What does the architect say? You already gave us some examples. So perhaps I'd like to give solutions, not to live with 50-degree temperatures, but to avoid living with that. I think that's what's the most important. How can we maintain global warming under the 2 degrees that we set? In architecture, there are 2 types of interventions. We either build new buildings or we renovate old buildings. We need new buildings to meet the demand, but how do we build new buildings while reducing the carbon footprint? We have to look at new technologies. We're using them more and more, and today we have software that makes it possible to define all of the materials that we use in building, to rank them, and to use materials that are more or less carbonized or decarbonized. So technology is an important point, and we really need to use that. Architects also have to adapt to these new technologies. Another point is the one I mentioned about Brussels. You need to use the right materials in the right place. This makes sense. Concrete structure that you mix with wood, that makes it possible to save time, money, and to increase sustainability. The question of cars is omnipresent. We need them, but you have to park cars. Underground parking is good for the city because you don't see them, but it's many cubic meters of concrete. It's very expensive, and it's not at all reversible. So we have to say, Bertrand, I want to tease the architect that you are with construction without talking about zero artificialization of the ground. Shouldn't we be working on 100% renovation? The architect that you are, shouldn't you be specializing in renovation? That was my second point. For existing buildings, we've seen it. We have a building heritage, existing buildings, and today demolishing a building to make a new one, it makes no sense. We all agree on that. We do it in some cases. But when we work on a project, we say, if there's a building that already exists, what can we do with this heritage? I have some projects. The one for Pardieu in Lyon, when you come out of the train station, you see a big building positioned in front of the train station, and this building didn't work from an urban development standpoint. So we decided when we looked at this building, that's why we won the contest 10 years ago. We said, okay, we're going to keep 80% of the structure and 70% of the facades. So that was already a really strong decision that we made. That's architecture of the future. Architecture of the future is how can we use the existing architecture in as much as possible. And there's also economic question. It generates savings. If we use what exists, we're spending less on construction. We start with carbon footprint that's negative because we're already using what's on site. So that's interesting. And we can also optimize construction time. We saw it in a project in Shenzhen. We reduced the construction time by 2 years because we renovated 80% of the existing structures. So these 2 years of increased rent for the project owner, and we thought that there would less 12,000 flights less between Amsterdam and Shenzhen. So that gives you an idea of the size.
Alors, tout d'abord,
Jérôme, so one of our solution sectors is we talked about the Lépine competition for innovation. There are solutions. We have to work on attenuation. This means governments. You have to make decisions, and this is time for businesses to come in. So for a long time, the companies have known there's been a problem with the climate change, and the companies started decarbonating in the years 2000, or they decarbonated their buildings, their transport systems. Our mission is that, at Équans, to provide solutions to consume less. This is major leverage. Consume green, consume flexible, and capture CO2. I'll give you an example. In Holland, about 10 years ago, they decided to get out of gas for new buildings and for major renovations. So they drill under the building to find cold water and add hot water. So all summer, you can air condition without air conditioning. You take the cold water from the ground, it goes through a heat exchanger, the water comes up at 20 degrees, and it's re-injected into the ground. And during the winter, you can use the warm water to create hand pump, the heat used as a heat pump. And something as simple as that, 96% of buildings in Holland are using this. You need water underground, obviously. 60% of the population in France has water available underneath between 20 and 60 meters deep. Why aren't we doing it? We didn't start it because energy was too cheap. That's the first example for buildings. Second example, concerning transport. Transport, we're going to electrify buildings. You see the rise in electric cars. There's reached a plateau because of the price. And I'm optimistic. I think that we will continue with electric cars. We'll have a very large production of batteries in Europe, and we have more economic models coming along. Electrification of cars is something that we can pay by the energy saving in buildings. another solution in terms of attenuation. Electrification of the locomotives on 40% in England. For instance, in France, it's 30%, 40% in England, using diesels. And there's also a simple solution. We worked on the renovation of the head offices of a French bank in Belgium. Initial starts with a B. So the name starts with a B. They decided a 6-level car park to keep only 5. And then half of the car park was filled with cold water and the other one with hot water at the lowest level. So you can air condition without air conditioning by using the water in the car park and heat the building with the hot water you've generated. So you have a solution like that all over the place. In industries, in plants, if you go to any plant, what do you see? You see hot pipes, because processes have been optimized. So we have created a team of about 100 people, fatal energy sniffers. They go into a plant and see what pipes are hot, and we recover the heat from that to be used for heating. And you can gain about 5 of the 40% of the energy, which is just heating the air. Let me talk about your solutions on energy, fatal or against non-fatal energy. Frédéric. Yeah, but complete something. There's still things to do in terms of energy sobriety, because minus 9% with the crisis now today. I think it was minus 20 to be gained. So as a network manufacturer, I think we can have a net minus 20%, but we'll have a plus 40 coming from electrification, but this is without CO2. So our projects are to be green and flexible. What is important is something that can be stored and unstored, because with the renewable energy today, we have projects on batteries, not small batteries, large batteries, so to several hundreds of megawatts. Easy to understand. You can store and stock and destock according to the needs. Something we believe a lot in is hydrogen, because hydrogen is a new energy vector, because it is produced, transported, and it can be stored. And it can answer the question I raised in my first point. That would be very useful. Let me just illustrate hydrogen. The project that we're working on is green steel. Green steel is very easy to understand. To make steel in the past, you used iron and coal, and you got steel and then 2 tons of CO2 per ton. And now we can produce directly green without iron, without producing CO2. So we have no more storage, and electrification can be solved at the same time. It's just a question of investment. These are the concrete projects to make electricity produce green and flexible, and make electricity available anywhere, at any time. Philippe, what about you? What do you need to do? First of all, go along with the solutions implemented or suggested by industrials, and there are many of them, as my colleagues have already said. I would like to add what we can do in the field of the monitoring of buildings and infrastructure. Today, it is something that the public or private owners are finding difficult to deal with. Why should I spend money to keep an eye on my dam or my bridge or anything? But if we are monitoring it, we can see any failures and anticipate something which could happen, which would be much worse. If it's with a monitoring system, it's something that we can develop. You mustn't forget, let's say, the global framework in which we work, where the people who define the conditions of use, whether regulators or legislators, must also be included in the movement. To come back to what Jérôme was saying about standards which really date back a long way, do not take climate conditions into account, industrialists, actors of a trust like ours, are those who validate the condition of use for everyone, because we need buildings for the public safely, going to live in sustainable housing. Everyone must be able to work together to prepare these standards and conditions of use, whether it is standards and regulations or conditions of use. It doesn't really matter. Got good news. Last year, what's the change? Well, the regulatory changes come along regularly. Reuse of wastewater did not exist in France, and now it's possible today. This collective work, everyone has a role to play to support the innovations that have been presented. So I believe that it will give an optimistic vision of the way that we can deal with the transition. Just say we don't know everything. Let me finish with a subject on the work conditions. Work conditions for employees at 50, 60 degrees or a little less. Do we know anything about it? Can we adapt to it? I don't have an answer. And I think we need to be able to anticipate it and think it over. If you work very early, work late in the day to avoid the main heat periods, has an impact obviously on the way you live. But I think we have to work collectively to find the best possible answers. Bénédicte, I knew we were going to talk about buildings. Let me take you to the forests. We talked about agriculture earlier. We know that the French forests are suffering. Are there solutions, very long term, to make sure that our grandchildren still have forests to go and walk in? In the south, there's something specific. 50% of the south is forests. And there's a very strong will to do it, to be able to plant and regenerate the forests. We created a center called Breathe with public and private funds, and we are selecting grants for which will allow on projects which allow natural regeneration with species which are adapted to the new climatic conditions. We have major partners who are funding this. If I can go a little further, I think that the political decision makers, I think it's important to mention it, have a great responsibility in terms of anticipation and attenuation regarding climatic conditions, because they have to carry public policies. This can be direct. The region has regional transport, and we've worked a lot on decarbonation of our transport, which is the buses, and the same must be done for railroads. So Thursday evening for projects for Aix, Avignon, Nice and Marseille, for having the town RER intercity trains has been organized, so we could offer an alternative, for instance, where people go to work, so that there is a true alternative. There's also supporting public policies, where we have the skills and we go along with the territories in terms of economy. We know that you have to produce and consume differently. The production conditions aiming at attenuating climate change are a cost for the company, and we have to have systems which integrate this support to businesses to be able to change. So there's a Sud Entreprise, and for instance, around the Étang de Berre, where there's a European fund called the Transition Fund, the Mediterranean Fund, and here the idea is to decarbonate the industry. And then we've got agriculture with the ecological transition contract, where we help our farmers to adapt. I won't make any political comments. Maybe we should take a bit of time for 2 or 3 questions. So do you have any questions? Everyone's too hot. Thank you. I have a question. We talked about territory building. Do you have any solutions to reorganize cities and manage this temperature increase in housing? Is a zoning policy in cities? Yes, at a regional level. Obviously, we work a lot with the water agency on having green areas, plant trees in towns, and for everything concerning urban renovation on housing, we have programs with low consumption buildings, durable, sustainable Mediterranean buildings, and also subsidize new buildings, because we work on renovation and in particular, and rehab of so trying to deal with the problems of the housing which uses too much energy. So what about digitalization, smart cities? Can that help us? To some extent, it's quite right. I think that vegetation in town, we studied for a number of French cities. By optimizing the vegetal surfaces in town, we can reduce the temperature by 0.8 to 1 degree in cities. Not 4, but 1 degree is good. And secondly, with more digital cities, when you have interconnected transport, you can reduce the number of cars and make the cities more fluid, have fewer traffic jams, and it reduces the heat in town. And third, avoid heat pumps on rooftops where they reject hot air. It's better to use the ground as heat exchanger. We're fortunate to be in a country where there's an average temperature which is perfectly acceptable and will be acceptable between summer and winter, so that we can store the heat peaks in the ground. Question? Something. Well, regarding the question that the young man was mentioned, I have worked on the subject. A lot of people not like it, but the only true sustainable solution to deal with a number of the issues would be to densify territories with transport, electrified transport systems. Everyone wants to have their own little house, which leads to a lack of densification. And you're told I live 10 kilometers from the village, but I'd like to have public transport, and it's not possible. Central question then, so how do we have a long-term strategy to densify? Obviously, we don't want to produce the buildings you have in La Courneuve. It's made of 4 or 5-story buildings with all the elements that have just been mentioned in terms of buildings. And another point, when we think about cities, even densified with electric transport systems, what is central, and there are a lot of urbanists working on the subject, you must move jobs closer to where people live. If you have to travel 20 kilometers, even with electrified transport, it's not ideal. So we have to think about how to transform cities with global warming. It means long-term restructuring of cities in the same way to restructuring the existing buildings. You must do the same for cities. But this means strategic planning, which needs to start now if we want results in 20 years. Also, we generate mentalities for everyone to agree not to have their individual house out of cities. A question for the panel. In terms of health, what are the effects of warming? If we have buildings at more acceptable conditions, it's a good thing, but can we go further?
Vous êtes la plus spécialiste en santé,
I have a health specialist here. Well, within the scope of, we look about health, a lot of work is going on in the region, for instance, by renovating the emergency departments. And then we're having changes, and we can see, if I link it to agriculture, something I know about, some things which didn't exist, parasites which didn't exist 20 years ago. It's the same thing for human beings. And we have a region working in a very committed way alongside the regional health service in Marseille hospitals. Just want to come back to health and safety at work, which is one of the major challenges. 155 million jobs lost because of long and intense heat episodes. It's not much fun, it's what we're experiencing today, but there's a lot of work still to be done here. There's attenuation, adaptation of work conditions, health and safety at work. We think of people working outside, but it's not only outside. We'll probably have to deal with this. There'll be new solutions which need to be found. If I talk about challenges in planning to be able to set up action over time, over 10, 20, 30-year period, we still need to make a number of efforts. If we talk about water planning, it's a major issue. Do we have the region is a pilot for ecological planning. When the state suggested it, regarding water planning, I think we'll review our agricultural irrigation strategy, because so with some territories who had never asked for anything are beginning to look into projects. We're going to review, see where we can be most ecological. We look at the territories in terms of irrigation, where we get the best possible water savings. And we have a double storage. We have the dams, and no doubt there will be less snow which fill the dams, and we'll need to find new solutions to maintain the water, because the Alps will no longer be providing the water after the snow. So we also have to make sure that such a person is not using the wrong water. There's agriculture, there's tourism, there's industry. We have to make sure we have a fair distribution of our resources and a good use of them. We're getting to the end. Maybe each of you take 30 seconds to tell us what is most important, what shall we take home, Bertrand, from the future ahead of us. What I could say, we need to act now, because today we can produce buildings which are smarter, more sustainable and economically acceptable, so we mustn't wait. Jérôme, hell is on top of the paving stones, paradise is underneath. We have a storage capacity for energy under a building, which can regulate peaks of heat without using an extra energy. And when it is possible, we should use it. And we need to implement it at a large scale. And a word for economist. Last year, we spent 250 billion on the effects of climate change, the disasters in the world. And this is increasing by 15% every year. It'd be 16 billion if we go on extrapolating. The figures are mind-boggling. And this is just to repair. Bénédicte. Well, attenuation is now. The situation demands it. I'm an optimist, same as you, and I think that when we are in adverse conditions, it produces great opportunities. The efforts for attenuation are underway, but we mustn't forget the medium-term adaptation, which will require more studies, other challenges, and we have to work collectively, everyone with their own role, to go on progressing in a society full of trust. This is what we all hope for. Two main messages: electrify uses, which means no more CO2 immediately, and place value on storage and managing flexibility to accelerate the transition and avoid these 50 degrees appearing everywhere. Christian, so you have the difficult task of concluding and summarizing all this. But you're going to be positive. I'm going to be quick because a lot of suggestions have been made. 3 words that I will take home from the discussion, words that you mentioned. There's attenuation, adaptation, and maybe planning. Directly or indirectly, but strategic planning is absolutely essential in the adaptation. I learned today, personally, that there are regulations which need to be modified to change the environment in which we are. We need also to adapt our expectations if we want to go towards a densification in terms of electrified transport. We have to change our anticipations concerning the way that we live, the way we organize cities, as we said. And what I would also like to say is a number of solutions, particularly the capacity to reduce almost immediately the energy consumption in buildings by 30–40% for practically all of them, or solutions to divide the needs by 10, which should allow us to accelerate the phenomenon mentioned earlier, the drop in needs. At the same time, it could also reduce the import of energy, which would be good for our commercial balance. A subject that we didn't deal with, but we still have another 20 sessions ahead of us to answer it, are the risks of non-linearity in transformation. That's very difficult to anticipate. We can see that we are perfectly in a position to adapt to changes of 1 or 2 degrees, but if the changes reach 8 or 10 degrees, it will be a different story. But on condition that we have an ambitious strategic planning, we have the ways to act, we have the means. This is not very optimistic, because we mustn't dream. There are going to be 4 or 5 degrees. There are 2 major non-linearities. You have the permafrost melting, and this has already started considerably. We also have the ice cap melting. It'd be technical. We have a latent heat which is going to disappear. The regulator, the temperature in the oceans. We don't know how to model these elements. When we talk about the 3 or 4 degrees that are going to hit us in the face, it's a complementary phenomenon, and we're not far from it being impossible to stop. So, concerning planning, in terms of water resources, as you said,
où on est à moins de 1%.
We have less than 1% in the south of using water reuse. We can't use wastewater everywhere, but it's all especially along the coastlines where the water goes out to sea. With the society working for the Provence canals, we have started working on it, working on watering olive groves and others in Provence. So the conclusion is there's a lot of work to do, but we are getting down to it. Thank you.